Well, thank you very much. It's kind of slightly odd for me to talk to a Norwegian audience, partly because as a kind of progressive, I think Norway is more successful and progressive in almost every way than Britain. So what have I got to teach you, really? But also because those of you who've been following the Brexit discussion, which is, I'm sure you know, this is a process by which we have shot ourselves in the foot. The major doctrinal political debate now in Britain, bizarrely, is between people who want us to be like Norway and people who want us to be like Canada. So just to say, I'm one of the people who'd like us to be like Norway. And if you want to know what I'm talking about, then ask me over lunch. So anyway, it's poignant for me to be here in Norway for those reasons. I'm going to talk about work more broadly. But I just wanted to say something about a labour market exclusion just at the beginning, because I think that there is some insights from work that we've done at the RSA which haven't really come up yet, but I just would share with you. So a number of years ago, I was involved in a study which looked at social segregation. So the segregation of people on the basis of ethnicity, of age, of class, and of all the different forms of segregation, the most stark, the biggest gap was between people who were unemployed and people who hired people. So people who were unemployed did not know anybody who hired people, and people who hired people did not know anybody who was unemployed. And so what I would say to you is, as well as the brilliant ideas that you've heard so far, there is a kind of relational side to this. And so I think a very important part of tackling exclusion is thinking about the distance between people who are excluded and work. And so the kinds of policies that I think are effective are work experience for young people in schools, to make sure that young people who come from families where there isn't any work have an understanding of what work is and what it involves. Strong one-to-one support for people, both formal support through active labour market policies, but also informal support like mentoring to connect people to the world of work. Also the importance of not just getting people into work, but supporting them to stay in work, which may be a challenge to the way in which they have operated in their lives before, and also trying to ensure that they can progress in work. And the final thing I'd say is this: given what we know about social networks, and given the way that we know that often unemployed people don't know many people who have jobs, actually to get one person in one of those networks into work and succeeding in work can have a powerful ripple effect on their wider social network. So while I work on this, as well as the kind of big levers, let's think also about the kind of interpersonal, relational, social network side of how it is you support people to change their life chances. So I was asked by the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Theresa May. I haven't checked the news this morning, so I think she's still Prime Minister. It's important to check quite often. I was asked by her to undertake a review of the future of work, looking particularly at the impact of technology. And so this piece of work, I think, came from, on the one hand, growing concern about forms of casualization and exploitation at the bottom end of the labour market, forms of work like zero-hours contract work and exposés of the treatment of people doing that kind of casual work. And on the other hand, growing concerns about the emergence of new forms of work, and particular gig work, platform work. So I generated my report, and although the report was published the year before last, and the government responded initially last year. I'm still waiting for a full response, but I'm delighted to tell you that that government response is going to happen in the next few days. So things move very slowly in the United Kingdom, but they do eventually move. So I'm looking forward to that response, and I hope it will be ambitious. So I want to talk about this notion of good work, but I want to start from that very idea of good work, because when I was in government and I was head of policy for Tony Blair in Downing Street, I wasn't responsible for the Iraq War. I just want to emphasize that. I was only responsible for good things. When I was in government, there was a phrase that was used in Whitehall, and that phrase was work first. And that view was all that matters is getting people into work. And there was a skepticism, actually, about things like training, anything other than work. Just get a job, any job. And I don't think we should throw that idea away. It is still the case that almost any job is better than not having a job in terms of your health and your well-being and your prospects. But I think the mistake that we made was to assume that there was some kind of trade-off between quality of work and quantity of work. And I don't think there is any necessary trade-off. I think you can have a vibrant labour market generating jobs, but you can also think about how it is you ensure that the quality of work that people undertake is good. And so although my report contains lots of detailed recommendations, the big idea in the report, and an idea which seems to have taken some momentum in Britain, and partly because we have tended to have rather outdated attitudes to work, is the concept of good work. And indeed, my report was called Good Work, and the government's response was called Good Work, and I have been asked to be now on the government's Industrial Strategy Council with a particular remit for good work. So this idea has kind of grabbed people's imagination a bit. And in my report, I offered a number of reasons why good work matters, and I won't go through all of them, but just 2 or 3. So one reason I said that good work matters is that certainly I grew up into a social contract, the kind of post-war social contract, and it was primarily a social contract with men at that stage. But at the heart of that social contract were 2 key ideas. The first was that if you worked, you would get better off every year. I mean, okay, there was economic cycles, but taking out the economic cycles, you would be better off every year. And secondly, that if you worked, you would be economically secure. Now, that is no longer a promise that we make to people in the UK and many other parts of the world. In the UK, living standards have been flat now for an unprecedentedly long period of time, and many people in work are also in poverty and aren't able to, for example, save significantly for their retirement. So the first argument was, if that old social contract has gone, we need a new social contract. And surely, if we can't promise people that work will make them better off every year and provide them with economic security, we should at least guarantee them they will get dignity and opportunities to progress in life through their work. I secondly said that good work matters because bad work is bad for health and well-being, and not just for the individual themselves, but if people experience bad work, work that makes them sick, and they drop out of work, these are people who are not paying taxes but are claiming benefits, and they're people who are using the health service. So there is an externality for bad work beyond its impact on the individuals. Thirdly, I argued that bad work is part of the UK's productivity problem. So we have a very poor productivity record. Our productivity hasn't increased over the last 10 years. That's part of the reason why living standards haven't increased. I'm afraid I don't know the statistics for Norway, but certainly the average French or German worker produces as much by Thursday lunchtime as a British worker produces by the time they leave work on a Friday afternoon. And I think that most people would argue that a big part of that is the quality of management in British industry, and a big part of that is the management of people. So good work, better work, is part of how it is we tackle the productivity challenge and the British Chancellor, in his budget 2 days ago, described productivity as the single biggest challenge facing the British economy. And the fourth reason I said that good work matters was to do with technology. And I want here just to make a little detour, if I might. Well, you can't stop me, can you? Because I'm up here and you're down there, so I can do whatever I like. I can sing, I can dance, I can... we are at a difficult moment. Things are less difficult perhaps in Norway than in other countries, but there are difficulties. And these difficulties, you see it in America, you see it in Britain, you see it in many parts of Europe. We see polarization, political polarization. We see populism, the rise of populism, the rise of politics which says there's a simple answer to complex problems, and that the answer should be perceived through the lens of us versus them, whoever us is and whoever them is. And also there is pessimism. You know, when I grew up, everybody believed that the future would be better than the past. And now, across many, many countries, most people think life will be tougher for their children and for their grandchildren than for themselves. And this is odd to me. I remember my grandfather was an engineer. And he was so excited by technology that seems kind of really quite, it seems quite basic now. I remember when the first color television came along. That's how old I am. When the first color television, he was so excited by color television. This was the future. He saw a direct route from color television to man on Mars. You know, you could just see this pathway. Now, technological change is much faster and amazing and taking place all the time, but yet people feel pessimistic very often about it. And why is that? Well, I think we need to learn a lesson from what's happened in terms of people's perception of globalization. So if I had stood here 15 years ago and talked about globalization, particularly if I'd been someone who was excited by it, someone selling books because I was talking about globalization perhaps, what would I have said? I'd have said the following things. I'd have said, globalization is an unstoppable force. Don't try and stand in its way, financial globalization in particular. I would have said, there will be winners and there will be losers. But there'll be more winners than losers, and the losers just need to kind of suck it up, just deal with it. Yeah? Thirdly, I might have said globalization will mean certain things that you care about, being able to kind of have national sovereignty, your own tax systems, protect your borders or whatever. Well, you just have to forget that stuff. It's all out of date. And then finally, I might have said, and by the way, financial globalization is very complicated, but don't worry, because these people in the banks, they're very clever, and they understand it, and nothing could ever go wrong. Now, of course, in 2007-8, that all collapsed. And part of the reason for Trump and Brexit and populism and the problems that we see is the failure of that narrative. Because in the end, people said, we don't want this. We don't want to be told we have no agency. We don't want to be told that we are merely victims. And so they respond to people who say, no, you can take your destiny back as a nation, as a people. What worries me is when we talk about technology, and particularly the impact of technology on jobs, it sounds like the same tune. Technology is an unstoppable force. There will be winners and losers, but the losers just need to put up with it. It'll mean things you care about, like protecting your children, or privacy, or democracy. Well, you just have to put up some of that stuff being damaged. And finally, it's quite complicated, but there are these guys in California, and they wear jeans, and they love their children, and they give money to charity. What could go wrong? So it feels to me as though that narrative is breaking down as well. And so I think that the lesson of the failure of the globalization narrative must be learnt, and we must, whenever we talk about technology, we must say technology must be judged by its capacity to make human lives better. And what worries me about a lot of the discourse about technology is that you read so many articles that basically say the robots are coming for your job. 30% of jobs will go, 50% of jobs will go. If I'm here in 3 years, none of you will exist, you will all be replaced by an algorithm. Yeah? And I think that this is not only wrong, because actually our record at predicting the impact of technology on the labour market as a whole is extremely poor. We're very bad at predicting it because it depends on the economic circumstances, it depends upon the emergence of new business models, and secondly, because I think politically, as I say, it's catastrophic. So I think it's important when we talk about the future of work that we say that the future of work does not depend upon technology, it depends upon us and the decisions that we make. So what are the decisions that we have to make? I want to talk about three areas before I finish. The first is regulation. So a lot of my report was about regulation, and particular about strengthening the protections of casual workers, those workers at the bottom end of the labour market. And as I say, I hope that the government will implement some of those measures. So we need a regulatory framework for work which is fair and consistent and adaptive, and which provides the right incentives. So one of the problems in many countries at the moment is that the tax system, the relationship between the tax system and the labour market is such that it encourages people to create bogus self-employment. So it encourages companies to hire people as freelancers and self-employ people because you have a much lower tax burden than if you employ people fully as employees. And that creates all sorts of arguments. Today in London, Uber is in its third hearing trying to defend itself from the idea that its drivers should be given worker rights, but more importantly trying to defend itself from the idea that it should have to pay labour taxes on its drivers. So we need a system which has the right incentives and which is fiscally sustainable. So we need the right hard regulations, we also need the right soft regulations. And what I mean by soft regulations is transparency. So one of the things I recommended in my report was that companies beyond a certain size should be transparent about everyone who's in their labour supply chain. Because generally speaking, larger companies who care about their reputations tend to treat people reasonably well, but very often it's through their kind of system of contractors that you get much less a good practice. I also think we are going to see in the future much more transparency about what it feels like to work for different organizations. I don't know whether in Norway you have Glassdoor, but Glassdoor is a website where people leave comments about the places that they've worked in. And it's building up a huge kind of database of what it is like to work in organizations. So I think in the future, most organizations beyond a certain size will have to publish statistics about job satisfaction and employee engagement. And that will have a good feedback effect, because employers who are known to be good employers and provide job satisfaction and engagement will find it easier to recruit and to retain talented people. So I think soft regulation will be part of the picture as well. The second thing is innovation. And so innovation is going to be critical to the future of work, and let me just identify 2 or 3 areas of innovation. The most obvious one, of course, is the gig economy, which is the single biggest shift, I think, that we've seen in recent years in employment. And what I'd say about the gig economy is that there are some people who say it's entirely a good thing and some people who say it's entirely a bad thing. I think it's neither of those things. I think it depends a great deal on the way that we regulate it and the norms that underpin it and the particular business models that we have. So yes, it's true that gig work can casualize people, that it can exploit people, that it can be problematic in terms of as I said earlier, the collection of taxes, for example. So there are difficulties and challenges about gig work. But on the other hand, it can provide people with enormous flexibility and control over when they work, what I called in my report genuine two-way flexibility. It can offer people who would find regular 5-day-a-week employment or having to commit to employment because they may have caring responsibilities or health issues. It can provide them with work which they can build around their lives. It can be a pathway into employment. It can be a pathway into entrepreneurialism as well. And also, I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which one of the things that people like about gig work is that they are providing a direct service to another human being. And that they, whether they are driving a taxi or you're gardening for somebody or you're doing odd jobs around someone's house or whatever it might be, that there is this direct relationship which can feel richer actually than working in a huge bureaucracy where you're kind of cut off from the people that you're trying to help. So gig work has got positives and it's got negatives. And quite a lot of what I do is talking to entrepreneurs in this space to encourage them as they develop new platforms to think about how those platforms can be offering good work and supporting people and encouraging, for example, freelance workers to save for health insurance and for their retirement. But there are other areas of innovation as well, which I mentioned briefly. Organizational innovation. I think increasingly young people do not want to work in hugely bureaucratic, hierarchical organizations. And so I think we're going to see more organizations which operate in very different kinds of ways that try to maximize the scope for people to have autonomy and to be able to be creative and entrepreneurial whilst working within an organization. I think this is one of the big challenges that organizations face in the future, is how to become flatter and more dynamic, particularly if they want to recruit and retain talented people. So innovation is going to be an extremely important element of this. And a final area of innovation that I think is important is around progression at work. One of the interesting things about gig platforms, of course, is that they give you a score. So every time you get your Uber, you can see that the driver is 4.8 or 4.9, and of course you get a score as a client as well. One of the things that we recommended in our report, my report, was that you should be able to take your customer rating with you when you move from one platform. And I think that things like customer ratings, digital badges, which are ways of accrediting small amounts of experience, I think we'll see over the next few years that we'll move to a world where it's a kind of LinkedIn world, if you like, where every worker has a kind of portfolio which captures not just their qualifications, but the experiences and aptitudes that they've shown in work. And I think that's a good thing, because it will aid people to see that there are transferabilities in their skills, that if you're dealing with human beings in a health setting, that is also relevant to an education setting or to a retail setting or whatever. But I want to end by just going back to where I began this. I talked about regulation, and regulation is important to the future of work. I've talked about innovation, and that's important to the future of work. I just want to end by going back to where I started, which is just to talk about values. So I think that the UK has a particularly kind of outdated view of the world, but in my report, but that's shifting now, but in my report I wanted to address two aspects of the way in which certainly in the UK we think about work that I believe needed to change. The first was the assumption that there just are terrible jobs, and that your attitude is simply to say, well, thank goodness I don't have to do that. Thank goodness I don't have to clean toilets. Thank goodness I don't have to be a security guard in a warehouse in the middle of the night. Thank goodness I don't have to work in a call center. So first of all, I think we need to get rid of the idea that there just are terrible jobs that you just don't want to do yourself or your children to do, and say, no, every job, if you design it right, can give people the scope for a sense of engagement and fulfillment and development. And secondly, to get away from the kind of master and servant view of work, which is that the deal at work is this: I pay you and you shut up and do what you're told. Because that's just not the most effective way to get people to work effectively. Overwhelmingly, the evidence shows that people who are engaged at work are more productive at work. And for me, that involves a shift from an instrumental way of viewing work. So the way we've tended to view work is instrumentally. You work to get money. The state wants people to work because they pay taxes and don't get benefits. Business wants people to work to generate profits. And move to, alongside that, a more intrinsic model of work that understands the intrinsic value of work in terms of human dignity and identity and status and well-being. And for me, that's part of an even broader shift, which is from the kind of post-war model, what I would call a kind of welfare economic model that says the role of the state is to prepare people for work, the economy generates wealth, and then the state takes some of that wealth and provides the welfare state. And I think there are problems about the sustainability of that model, as we've been hearing, and also with demographic change, and we need to move slightly more to a well-being economy model, one which says that what happens in the economy needs to contribute to people's sense of well-being and to minimize negative externalities. Now, this is an idea we accept in relation to sustainability, for example, that the economy must not have a negative impact on the environment. But I also think when we think about work, that we need to think about how it is that people's experience of the economy is one which enables them to live their lives as carers and citizens, one which gives them a sense of identity and status, and one which gives them a sense of possibility in their lives. The first sentence of the report that I wrote for the government was that we should be committed to every job in the British economy being fair, being decent, and offering people scope for fulfillment and personal development. And going right back to what I said at the beginning, in these times when we can feel pessimistic, it seems to me that that ideal of good work for everybody might be the kind of idea that we need to renew people's sense of possibility about the future. Thank you.